So I think that someone with understanding of, say, a subject matter can grasp how the various elements of that subject matter depend upon and relate to one another. So that's the understanding of a subject matter, but I also think we can have understanding not just of subject matters, but of objects and perhaps people. And one thing that kind of understanding involves, I think, is figuring out how those different objects or things will, the kind of possibilities that lie in front of them. So if I were to interact with the object in a certain way, if I were to make certain adjustments, how would the object react? What are the possibilities that might obtain? So when it's a structure, I think of understanding as involved with the person with understanding grasps how possible changes in one part of the structure will lead or fail to lead to possible changes in other part of the structure. When it's an object, I think that you understand it when you can ascertain the possibilities that lie in front of it. So how does this relate to wisdom, would be a question. Well, so in my view of wisdom, the wise person knows how to live well, and in particular knows what's more or less important for well-being. So a foolish person might think something like money is the most important thing for well-being, or status, or reputation. But a wiser person would realize that relationships or integrity or virtue would be more important for well-being. And so there's, as it were, this range of ways, of values that we can choose that lie in front of us, and the various ways in which we might express these values. And I think that having more of a possibility space in front of you, more understanding of how human beings have lived and might live, allows a person the possibility of wisdom, because they can see, as it were, what life is like. They can imagine what life is like if some of these priorities, if some of these values are prioritized rather than others. So why are these important? I mean, this is just a basic human need, of course, to figure out. We don't just want to obtain isolated bits of facts about the world. We want to see how these various facts hang together. And of course, we all have a natural desire to know how to live well, and figuring out who has lived well and what kinds of lives, embodying what kinds of values. That's just a natural human concern. I think this conference has been wonderful because it's really helped me develop my own thinking of it. One thing I was thinking of earlier today is, so imagine you had access to like a storyteller, who knew about just millions of stories of actual people, actual cities and empires and villages and particular human lives, things that have actually occurred. We could just learn so much about human behavior, about what looks like, again, a good life, about how the likely effects of certain choices rather than others, which I think is also important to living well. So history, as it were, is that storyteller come to life. So if you were the storyteller and you knew a million stories, I could just sit here and learn from you the whole time. Most of us don't have access to that kind of particular person, but we do have access to historians who can relate these stories. Again, not just about people, but about cultures and civilizations and villages and empires. And literature, if you want to think of it this way, it allows us access to even more millions of stories, possible ways in which things were or might be or could have been. Or could still be, and again, it's. I think all of us are naturally attuned to stories that have a ring of truth to them. So you could make up something which just seems false and artificial, and we wouldn't give it much time. But if you're a talented storyteller, you give, as it were, you mold people and situations which sound like they could obtain, sound like real people who could go through these real struggles. And in a way we have, it's even more magical because it gives us, as it were, God's eye input into what might be happening in their psychologies, how they might be feeling and reacting. So it's like having access to the super storyteller, writ large or magnified a million times. So again, I think we have this natural desire to figure out how people have lived, what different alternatives have lived to resulted in a good life, how people will react to certain choices. So it expands our sense of possibility and allows us kind of, again, just better material through which to make our own kind of choices, I think. So there's, again, this sense in which I think it expands possibilities, but it also, in doing so, it allows us to see, I think we get sensitive to the hidden assumptions and values that are packed into many worldviews. So you become sensitive to kind of the values and assumptions which might constrain how people see the world. And I think this is very important in, say, a democratic, pluralistic context if we're going to have meaningful conversations with one another and if we're going to learn from one another. I think we have to be sensitive to, again, what we take for granted, how our perspectives are constrained, and how our perspectives might be broadened. And if an important benefit of studying the humanities is, again, being sensitive to possibility spaces, to the way our possibility spaces are constrained or can be broadened. So this is a benefit in terms of democratic citizenship and conversations. But also, as we've discussed at this conference, it seems like those same kind of imaginative abilities are very important for science, for imagining how experiments might play out, how if you were to change certain variables, values of variables, other things would take place. I don't think exactly that they're different skills looked at in a broad way, to think counterfactually, as you said today, to think in terms of alternative possibilities. That could be at the core of kind of rich scientific thinking, and it could be at the core of rich humanistic thinking, too.